thank you for joining me again today. I have a lot of information, but before we get to the rest of this stuff about Israel and all that, we need to reel it back just a little bit here. They say that science doesn't lie, but history shows us science can be bent, twisted, and dressed up to serve the powerful. Yesterday, they called it eugenics, measuring skulls, sterilizing the unfit, deciding who deserved to live or die. Today, they call it genomics, shiny labs, DNA charts, ancestry tests, but the same elite institutions hold the reins. When the question of the Khazars come up, they wave it away. No evidence, they say. But a bottleneck can erase entire bloodlines, leaving silence where stories once stood. Silence isn't proof, it's just convenient. This isn't about chromosomes alone. It's about who controls the narrative, who funds the tests, and who benefits when inconvenient truths are buried. The past didn't vanish, it was erased into the bloodlines. I was looking into DNA and the Jews and the Israeli angle again, and after my head stopped spinning, it became clear. What they do is this: in order for them to say, well, we know in these regions before the flood, these ancestors were here and they were this and that. Well, once my head stopped spinning, I figured out what was behind all these little things. So, because remember, we understand it that they seem to want us to do DNA tests by spitting into tubes, right? Like 23andMe, spit into a tube or take a blood test, and they'll tell you what your DNA evidence is. Well, I've already talked endlessly about the many issues with that, because for all those people spitting into those 23andMe tubes, they were they were thinking they were going to have privacy, right? Yeah, I got called off the table when 23andMe went bankrupt. Whoops! Now all of your data is out for everybody to get. This is all about data mining, right? So anyway, so I asked these people, the scientist people, to try to explain to me, how do you come up with these numbers? Like, how do you figure out what people were in Africa a few thousand years ago, right? Well, it's actually quite simple. What they do is they find people from that region and they do a spit test or a blood test, and then they compare it to some other things which they themselves have, right? So see, the evidence starts to get a little shaky here right away. So by comparing this spit or blood test to some person they claim was from that region, they can come up with some other analysis. Well, I kept thinking, well, this really isn't adding up here. I'm not really tracking how this is all working. So then I thought, well, let me first take a look at who are these people doing the test, right? Well, that's when the whole thing started to unwind. So it is, well, what's happening is we have 23andMe, like we have Ancestry.com, okay? And people, just for fun, would spit in those tubes and mail it in, and they'd come back with these results saying where their family came from, supposedly, right? But oh, what a tangled web we weave when we first start to practice to deceive. So yes, the web gets rather complicated here, and the reason is that they're using this information that they've gotten from people because there's these universities and stuff which are doing the same kind of thing that 23andMe was doing. So we have two different groups. So today I'm going to be talking about the university groups because those are the people who are saying the Khazars did not exist. Absolutely, they weren't real. Because here's the catch. If the Khazars are real, then the entire story about Israel falls into the dumpster. Nonstop. Right into the dumpster goes that story. So let's reel this back. But before I get started, today a couple pretty alarming things. Israel strikes a Qatar Hamas office in assassination attempt, trying to assassinate somebody from Hamas. Well, I'll tell you something about Hamas in a minute here. And also, the Korean government is freaking out because 300 nationals were actually chained up by ICE agents in the U.S. Over some, I put the link down below. Here's the deal. The U.S. wanted these Koreans to come and open this plant. I guess they were having some visa problems. So, and to get ahead of the problem, they just went ahead and made a few irregular things with their visas, not like criminal things, right? And they sent over these people to get the plant going. Now, remember, they're doing this at the behest and an invitation of the U.S. government, right? So what happens to those people? Well, they just swooped down and arrested them all. So they're just trying to make sure that nobody comes to this country to do business because this country is going down like a rocket ship. So that's what's going on there. So first, let's get down to basics. The name Israel comes from the Hebrew. It first appeared, of course, in that Bible in Genesis 32:28. It says, Jacob is renamed Israel after wrestling with an angel. They have such crazy stories, right? So evidently some Jacob person was wrestling with an angel and got named Israel. And the most accepted meaning is this, is he struggles with God or God contends. But there's another breakdown I'd like to talk about. Israel is called El, one of the earliest Semitic words for God. Sa, to struggle, contend, or rule. So Israel literally means one who struggles with God or God rules. But there's another meaning that they consider symbolic. Well, I consider it the real meaning, and it breaks down to these parts. The is part is Isis for the Egyptian goddess. Here we're back in our gypsy land, right? Ra is the Egyptian sun god. El is the Semitic name for God. And that means the fusion of goddess, sun, and God. So I believe that that's the definition we're really looking at, right? Egyptian goddess, Egyptian sun god, and the Semitic name for God. And we've already talked about this. The El they're talking about can also translate to elites, right? Okay, so they say that. So then I want to clear up a definition. When I was reading along through all this mind-bending DNA business, I read the name bottleneck again. Now, I mentioned bottleneck a long time ago. Bottleneck is what it can mean is a point in history where a lot of incest was going on. Okay, that was my understanding of only in the last few years. Okay, and I started to get kind of tripped up again because the name bottleneck has a new meaning. Because here's basically what happened when these people were traveling around and hiding out, there was a bottleneck in their DNA, okay? The bottleneck could be a few things. So in popular genetics, a bottleneck refers to a population sharply reduced in size for at least one generation. Because only a small fraction of the population's genetic diversity survives, this can lead to reduced variations, increased genetic drift, and greater likelihood of inbreeding. And that is what you're really looking for, is the inbreeding, which can amplify harmful mutations. So this is where the association with incest and inbreeding comes from. If a bottleneck only leaves a few chosen, close related individuals, future generations may show signs of inbreeding, depression, reduced fertility, higher incidence of genetic disorders. And of course, I have talked endlessly about those Ashkenazi Jews and the piles and piles of genetic disorders, which they have themselves created through this bottleneck, okay? So over time, and this was just in the last couple years, okay? So they just made this switch recently because remember, this is the lie that holds on to all of that property over there and all those Bible lies, right? So over time, the term bottleneck has been broadened to mean any process that restricts diversity or slows progress, meaning things like evolutionary biology, still means a sharp population reduction, but not necessarily tied to only incest. And it could also mean business engineering. A bottleneck is a point that slows down an entire process, a single slow machine in a factory line, for example. Or in computer science, it could mean the limiting factor in system performance, CPU speeds versus memory access. But no, What it really means is inbreeding. Okay, let's keep that part in our brains. So when you read older works, which really, as of a few years ago, I'm talking, it can't be when I talked about it the last, this bottleneck thing, it really had to have been in the last 3 or 4 years because I was talking about it, okay? So they're calling it an older word, right? It says, um, when you read older works, a genetic bottleneck was often discussed in terms of inbreeding and incestuous populations. Think of isolated island groups or post cat excuse me, I'm having catas, catastrophic survival. Today, the technical definition is more neutral. It just refers to a drastic reduction in population size and genetic variation. See, they went from specifically bottleneck was about inbreeding and incestuous populations. I remember this as clear as a bell. And if you dig through all of my recordings, you will hear me saying this numerous times in the past only 3 or 4 years. So who else is famous for inbreeding? Well, the European royal families. European monarchies often married within a small circle of royal noble families to preserve alliances and wealth. And just a simple explanation, I think that bottleneck happened because they literally were there in their planning stages and they needed to bump up their population within their own ranks. That's what they were doing. They were literally hunkering down, having sex with each other, and building up their own numbers. Sorry to be so crude, but that's how it looks like to me. But at the end of the day, I've got all of my notes down below, and they're all over on my website. So you take a looky for yourself. So typically, it refers to inbreeding, right? And the European monarchies often did this. The Habsburgs, our favorite friends now, Otto Habsburg, of course. No, I'm just kidding. Just the Habsburgs in general, a famous example. Centuries of intermarriage led to the Habsburg job and fertility problems. The Spanish case, Charles II of Spain, 1661, 1700, right around that same time frame, sometimes was called the Bewitched, was a product of generations of close kin marriage. He had several health issues, infertility, cognitive problems, and his death without an heir ended the Spanish Habsburg line. The bottleneck aspect. By limiting their breeding pool, royals created an artificial bottleneck. The lack of genetic diversity amplified deleterious recessive traits. And I also have a link to that. The Ashkenazi, I played this link in the past. It's a lady, and she's calling the alarm on all of their genetic issues. And this is another theory of mine why they had to steal all these children. I'll be getting back to the stolen children soon here, but they had to populate with children that were white and also children because maybe they couldn't have the children themselves, right? By that point. So they say that founding populations were groups like the Icelanders or Ashkenazi Jews show genetic bottlenecks effects due to small founding populations followed by marrying within the community. So there's a couple of examples. One, they say this horse nearly went extinct in the 20th century, and every living individual today descends from just 12 to 15 horses. The genetic bottleneck has made careful management necessary to avoid inbreeding problems. Well, maybe there weren't even horses before the 20th century. You can't just blindly agree that, I don't know, maybe there were horses. Maybe that was a new part of the game board. I don't know. But anyways, I'll keep going here. So bottlenecks equals incest by definition. But incest and inbreeding often results from bottlenecks because small populations have limited partner choice. Historical human dynasties like the Habsburgs show a socially created bottleneck, while wild animals like the cheetahs or these horses show natural bottlenecks. And that Habsburg job, well, we've only seen sketches of that now, haven't we? Otto Habsburg does not have that job. He's got a tiny looking female looking face, if you ask me. Otto Habsburg, our new best friend. So now let's talk about one other deception while I have your attention here about Israel. Israel, today they said they were bombing a bunch of people in Hamas and stuff. Okay. Hamas is the big guy. We would not be there, but we can't. Hamas is making us do all of these bad things. It's all Hamas's fault. Well, media seems to portray Hamas as primitive or impoverished. The reality is far more complex. Hamas manages a sophisticated and significant financial infrastructure. I saw this special on YouTube in the last few months talking about the rich and wealthy of Hamas. So, Iran, the big bad wolf over there that's hiding all the drug running through the whole world, Iran has been a principal patron of the area since the 1990s. It's provided military and financial support and about 30 million annually to Hamas. So they say maybe 350 million per year by 2023. Okay, so Qatar and Turkey have also been major supporters. Qatar alone has transferred over $1.8 billion to Hamas over time, with estimates of 30 million monthly. Now remember, everybody's kind of guessing on these numbers because these are criminals, right? So Hamas controls administrative functions in Gaza, including assets such as real estate and agricultural land, along with a holding company called Beit Al-Mal and a stake in the Al International Bank. They're not just cave-dwelling freaks over there, okay? They collect taxes and levies. Estimates place annual revenues from taxation at around $620 million, including tunnel-based smuggling trade. If that's even true. So their global investment portfolio could be worth between 500 million to 1 billion, with assets in Turkey, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. Isn't Sudan an interesting choice? Huh. I got to get back to Sudan because I discovered something pretty big about Sudan, but not for today. Anyway, so another reason is this cryptocurrency. Remember crypto Jews, cryptocurrency? I'm sure they got that name from there. They've always called these people crypto Jews, right? Hamas operates a complex international financial network that includes money laundering, crypto, and informal donations. The U.S. Treasury, another beacon of reality, has investigated 165 million in cryptocurrency transactions linked to Hamas in recent years. So this is only part of the story, but while billions in humanitarian aid flow into Gaza from the UN, EU, and others, Hamas can redirect tax and other incomes toward military operations, letting aid serve civilian needs. The reports also warn of aid diversion and misuse, such as using industrial materials, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's look at their elaborate financial infrastructure. They have leadership in exile, enjoying wealth. High-ranking Hamas officials reside abroad in Qatar, Turkey, Lebanon, and enjoy luxury lifestyles, including five-star hotels and private jets. And all of these things that I'm saying today, I have them all on my website along with links, so you can go and look at directly the source links for yourself. I certainly would not have the time or energy to make up all this stuff. So, they five-star hotels and private jets. By contrast, many Gazans face poverty, siege, and conflict, feeding public resentment and the perception of corruption. You think so? So Zahir Jabarin heads Hamas's financial bureau and is often described as its de facto CEO. He oversees an investment portfolio estimated at over $500 million with operations in real estate, stock markets, and across Turkey, Lebanon, and the Gulf. Hamas has historically established financial entities like Al-Aqsa Islamic Bank and Bet Al-Mal, facilitating fundraising and money transfers. And like I said, links to all of this is all documented, okay? So the U.S. imposed broad sanctions on Hamas. And remember, the U.S. started Hamas, okay? The U.S. and Israel did all the original funding to get Hamas started. Oh, what a tangled web we weave. So the U.S. imposed broad sanctions on Hamas's financial networks from October 2023, targeting individuals and facilitators in Gaza, Turkey, Qatar, Sudan, and Algeria. Authorities have sanctioned an Italian-based charity accused of channeling up to $4 million to Hamas over the decade, enabling 10 million month. I don't know, but anyway, money is flying. Money is flying all over the place. But they say that Western military actions and aid blocks have severely disrupted Hamas's revenue streams. Gaza's fighters and civil servants now face half or missing salaries. Monetary scarcity is sparking protests. Yes, well, there's a lot of money, and the people in Gaza certainly aren't living it up. So I can't imagine Hamas is getting money from them from taxes, but they're just robbing everybody. So Hamas sits atop a modern, covert, and multifaceted financial system, not the cave-dwelling caricature often portrayed in simplistic media. Its wealth stems from structured state support, taxation, investment, and financial networks stretching across borders. At the same time, efforts to undermine that network through sanctions and military operations are generating financial strain. Nah, I hardly doubt that. Here's a reason why they're in Sudan. If I don't get back to Sudan, it's quite simple. It's a bloody conflict. No one is talking about it. They're ripping the shreds out of Sudan right now. And it's because it links to Al Qaeda. And who started Al Qaeda? Ding, 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 ding. Okay, so on to the topic for today. So, we first start off with eugenics, 1880s to 1940s. Right off the bat, they're coming up with ways to get rid of us, right? The word eugenics literally meant improving the human race. It was open about controlling who got to have children. The top schools, Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, and big money Rockefeller and Carnegie funded it. Their tools were crude, family trees, measuring skulls, and passing sterilization laws. Their stated goal was they wanted to get rid of undesirable traits. What they really did was decide who was fit or unfit to live, marry, or reproduce. Governments used it to run sterilization programs in the US, Sweden, and Germany, leading directly into Nazi racial policies. And if you're asking me, well, gee, Diane, why are you talking to us about eugenics again? Haven't you said this for the millionth time? Yes, I have, and I will keep saying it for the millionth time. Everybody acts like when you bring up these subjects, that was a million years ago. It was not. And today I'm going to show you it was not a million years ago. And the exact same players are at the game board again today. So then so that was that era. They come up with the word eugenics, right? After World War II, eugenics was disgraced and treated as bad science of the past, okay? So that was 1880 to 1940s. Now we put a little shuffle in our step here. Today, they're calling it genomics. 1990s to today. The word genomics, that Genomics, sounds modern, scientific, even life-saving. It's the study of whole genomes. Big players are new names, broad institutions. So the funders are often the same elites like the Rockefellers, Wellcome, and the governments. Their tools are high-tech, DNA sequencing, spit-in-the-tube ancestry tests, complex computer modeling. So their stated goal has always been to improve health, trace ancestry, or map disease risks and understand human migrations. What they really do is this: they decide who belongs in which population and push certain identity stories, like the Ashkenazi Jews came from the Lebanon, Europe, and no Khazars. Government and industries are tightly tied in. Health systems, universities, pharma, even military research. Lots of controversies with these groups I'll be getting into later, but today genomics is branded as humanitarian and the future of medicine, but it still carries the same hidden biases and political influence. Eugenics and genomics are two faces of the same coin. The words and tools change, but the same powerful institutions and founders are behind both of them. Eugenics decided who was fit or unfit. Genomics decides what stories populations can tell about their origins. So eugenics was founded as a formal field by Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, the guy who wanted to tell us we came from the monkeys, right? It also came from universities in the UK and the US, Harvard, Cambridge, UCL, etc. They all set up eugenic societies. The goal was to improve human populations through selective breeding. So the early 1900s, Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie institutions heavily funded eugenics and hereditary studies. Racial science programs began in the US and Europe, often targeting immigrants, poor people, and the disabled. Gee, why is that? 1910s to the 1930s, eugenics laws were passed in the US and Europe, and tens of thousands of people were sterilized. Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany becomes a major center for eugenics and racial biology. These ideas spread internationally, influencing policy and academia. In the 40s, of course, we had the Nazi racial science that builds directly on earlier eugenics, leading to the Holocaust. After World War II, eugenics as a word became toxic. Many eugenics organizations quietly rebranded as population studies or human genetics. 1950s to the 70s, state-run sterilization programs continued quietly in the U.S., North Carolina, California, Sweden, and elsewhere. 1950s to that was not 100 years ago. 1970s was just a few years ago. United Nations and World Health Organization during that era, up until the 70s, were still promoting mass sterilization, family planning in the global South, funded by Rockefeller and others. In the 1970s to the 1980s, not that long ago. So when people wave their hand at you and say, old news, keep in mind, this is current news, okay? And this is leading up to exactly where we are today. 70s to the 80s was the last forced sterilizations under eugenics laws occurred in the U.S., in the North Carolina and California, and in Sweden. Survivors later pushed for recognition and compensation. Well, they bit the dust on that one. Okay, 1990s, here again, not that long ago. That's when they launched this Human Genome Project. The major players, Wellcome Trust out of the UK, Broad Institute, Harvard, MIT, Max Planck in Germany. These institutions, backed by elite philanthropy, carry forward genetic research under the new banner of genomics. The 2000s, genomics expands massively with SNP chips and genome-wide association studies. Here again, the year 2000 in my book was not that long ago. Still in the year 2000, Jewish population genetics, medical genetics, and ancient DNA studies emerged. Not that long ago. 2010s, the folks at Wellcome Sanger Institute had a little bit of a scandal on their hands. They were caught in Africa using African DNA samples without proper consent, and that's called genomic colonization. There was another thing about this David Wright person was criticized by oversimplified writing on race genetics, accused of fueling old race science debates. And then here again, the 2020s, 5 years ago, genomics hailed as frontier science, precision medicine, ancestry testing, ancient DNA. Critics warn of data colonization, the use of genetic samples from marginalized groups without equal power or benefit sharing. Legacy of eugenics still shapes how communities view genetics research. What we call genomics, that's Genomics, today directly drew out of the same institutions, funders, and frameworks that once promoted eugenics. The methods and language have changed, but the power structures and the trust issues remain. So, why do they want to avoid the Khazar question? The Khazar hypothesis challenges the official origin story of Ashkenazi Jews, which has political weight in Israel and beyond. If Khazar ancestry were shown to be significant, it would undermine the Levantine continual narrative that Israeli and Jewish institutions emphasize. For genome centers with historical tie to eugenics, racial science, and elite funding, admitting such complex issues could expose inconsistencies in past narratives, their role in shaping identity through selective science. In other words, why give themselves up? Why would these experts give up the fact that the Khazars are part of this whole thing? They need to have the Khazars out of this scenario. So, why do they do all this? Well, they did all this because I'm going to scroll down here for a second. They did all this because they need the Khazars out of the picture. So it was called eugenics when they wanted to control populations through coercion. Now it's called genomics, where these same institutions shape identity and history with scientific authority. Avoiding the Khazar question isn't an accident. It's part of protecting themselves from exposure and keeping control over the narrative. So, the Khazar origin hypothesis is rejected by mainstream genetics. And I'm going to have to put this on hold for a second here.
Okay, so first, let's look at the mainstream scientific consensus about the Khazar origin hypothesis. It is rejected by mainstream genetics. There is a genome-wide studies show substantially shared Middle Eastern Levantine ancestry in Ashkenazi Jews combined with European mixture. Khazar contribution, if present at all, appears limited and unnecessary to explain the genetic data. And here's where I stumbled on the loophole here. There's always something missing. When you look at these people's reports, always look for something missing. The reason they were saying that there were no Khazars in that region was because the sampling was not there to show any real activity from Khazars in that region in that time frame, okay? But here is my theory. My theory is that makes perfect sense because there would not be that many Khazars during that bottleneck period because they were probably regrouping and there were not that many of them. The Khazars held the elite position. So if you look at a whole group of, I don't know, let's look at 1,000 people. If only 1% of those people were Khazars, yeah, they wouldn't show up on these studies because it's too limited, right? But they still could, in fact, be there. And that was a loophole that I keyed into here because they're saying, well, not enough evidence. Well, yes, because if the Khazars were a very limited part of that entire group, yes, it would not necessarily translate into what these people are talking about. So I won't get too complicated in all of this because, like I said, when you look down below or on my website, you'll see that I'll just read one method and you'll see how you start to get your head spinning. One method is a genome-wide SMP analysis, autosomal DNA. Principal component analysis, CPA. Admixture structure modeling, QADM slash this IBD, identified by descendant segment sharing. And you think, wow, my head about spun off. Well, that's because that's the whole plan, right? But what it is that Ashkenazi Jews cluster tightly together. They sit between other Jewish Middle Eastern group and Southern Europeans. This pattern is consistent with Levantine and European admixture, not a primary Caucasus Khazar source. And that is seen consistently across landmark full genome studies of Jewish populations. So there's direct rebuttals using expanded reference panels. The retested Khazar hypotheses with wider samples from Europe, Middle East, and the historical Khazar region. The findings were this: no evidence from genome-wide data of Khazar origins for the Ashkenazi Jews. And the best fit models, they said, were Middle Eastern plus European admixture. And they say it does not show unusual affinity to Northern Caucasus groups such as Khazar proxies. Well, that basically is because there was a bottleneck during that exact time we're talking about. The time that everybody's arguing about were the Khazars there during this period, that exact period is called a bottleneck time. And the Khazars were, in fact, there. There just were not that many of them, because then they went and changed the name of the bottleneck, right? So, and the bottlenecks also follow exactly the time frame of all this Khazar history business. So, there's these 4 or 5 different groups that are in charge of all this stuff, and there's one person who's an outlier, and this person is named. He's a pro Khazar person. He is pitching the pro Khazar thing. Well, of course, they're all against him, right? So he used Armenians and Georgians as Khazar proxies, and no proven Khazars descendant population exists, but later studies, yeah. So there's one lone wolf in this thing. So Ashkenazi Jews, they keep claiming, are a mix of Levantine and European ancestries. So, but there was a one bottleneck. But let me get down to the other one. Because when you start to read through some of this stuff, you start to really because they measure all these different things, the autosomal DNA, blah, 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 blah. But really, what we're looking at is that bottleneck, right? Because they say that no sequence Khazar brutals exist. And the proxies they used came out of Armenia, Georgians, and North Caucasus. And those are considered imperfect. So if Khazar ancestry were major, it would leave obvious genetic signatures, and that is not observed. And that was a key trick here. It says if Khazar ancestry were major, Khazar ancestry was not major. Khazars were playing the role of the elite, so that you would not find a significant number of Khazar people in this study to begin with. See, that's where the whole thing gets spun off backwards, right? So, how did they figure out this ancestry DNA? Well, they collect saliva tubes and they mail them back, and they send them to accredited labs. And then what they come up with is the ancestry, the health traits, not fine-grained history debates, because they cannot know the fine-tuned things. They absolutely do not know that. So they go around and they recruit at universities, synagogues, hospitals, and all these other places, and they collect saliva tubes or blood draws, exact same thing as Ancestry DNA was doing. So where are their labs? Well, this is where the suspicion comes in, okay? The labs are the Hebrew University, Weizmann Institute, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Broad Institute, Wellcome Sanger in the UK, and Max Plancker in Germany. So they claim it is anonymized, it's peer reviewed, and deposited in public archives. So why not just use 23andMe instead of cutting out this all university stuff? Well, they claim because of consent and privacy rules, and that limits academic use. Well, now they got access to it all, right? But they also claim it's different aims. that 23andMe reports too coarse for deep history questions. And academic control is preferred for precision or lie telling, if you'd ask me. So, hang on a second here. So, before I accept any results, I want to know who's handling this stuff. Okay, let's say we agree they got these people to spit in tubes, okay? Well, it relies on volunteers, recruitment, lab centers. Independent labs across continents ensure results are not biased by one source. Yeah, here again, it's like that Bible. Yeah, we can tell you who did it because 4 of our other labs did it. So they all play off each other. So the best available genetic evidence shows Ashkenazi Jews descend from a Levantine Middle Eastern base. See, this is where the lie is. So um, I think it's because of this bottleneck in the exact same area, because only a small number of people contribute genetically to the future population. Genetic diversity is, in fact, reduced. So let's look at the timing of this Ashkenazi bottleneck. Population genetic studies converge on a late medieval bottleneck. 30 to 400 individuals formed the genetic base of modern Ashkenazi Jews. That's only 30 to 400 individuals. Okay, this is what I'm saying. There weren't that many of them. They were hanging out, having sex with each other during this bottleneck. And this same bottleneck is a contested time of whether they came from Israel or they didn't. So the bottleneck happened around 25 to 35 generations ago, which corresponds to roughly 600 to 800 years. So exactly in that 1200 to 1400 CE date that we're looking at right here. After this contraction, the population expanded rapidly in Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. So they connect this bottleneck to demographic restrictions. Jewish communities were relatively small and isolated. Small founder groups moving into Central and Eastern Europe created founder effects. No, I think it's a simple answer. There weren't that many of them. They were hovered around that area while they were doing their plotting. Because they say modern Ashkenazi Jews share unusually high levels of DNA identity with one another. Medical impact, several founder mutations. And I have that link down below for you to listen to them all over for yourself. They have all kinds of diseases and they're brewing with diseases because of all of the incest. So they say the incest analogy is not literal close relative incest, but genetic isolation plus repeated marriage within a small community. Well, you say tomato, I say tomato. I still say incest. Tight group of people within a short community. So here is the fact. The severe bottleneck occurred 1200 to 1400 CE, 600 to 800 years ago in Europe. It reduced the Ashkenazi population to only a few hundred ancestors, after which they expanded rapidly. They claim they always try to clean this up. They say, well, this didn't mean systematic incest, but it did mean marriage within a very small, close community, which produced the same genetic effects as if the group were much more inbred on a larger outbred population. So, when scientists run models on Ashkenazi Jews' genomes, they consistently find a bottleneck between 25 to 35 generations ago. Using the standard conversion of 25 years per generation, that equals 600 to 900 years ago. Different labs using IBD tracks run these other things and coalesce simulations all converge on this same range. So this genetic data point to roughly 1200 to 1400 CE. So let's look at these windows that might overlap with this. There were supposedly the Crusades. The Crusades took on from the year 1096 to the 1200s. That was mass persecutions and massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland and France. And the Rhineland is where all these Ashkenazi Jews got started. Also, there was the Black Death persecutions of 1347 to 1351. Jews were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to massacres and expulsions across Germany, France, and Spain. The expulsions, late 1200s to 1400s, Jewish communities were expelled from England in 1290, France 1306 and 1394, Spain 1492. Also remember 1492, Columbus set sail for America, right? Smaller groups survived and migrated eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where the Ashkenazi population rebounded dramatically in the following century. So here we have them in Poland, right there in Poland. So, genetic studies, the bottleneck is dated to 1200 to 1400 CE. Historical records show multiple waves of population crash, expulsions, and migration between 12th and 14th centuries. These line up closely that geneticists and historians generally agree the bottleneck event identified in DNA is the same population crash and rebuilding documented in history today. So yes, the time frame scientists find in testing 600 to 800 years ago is the exact same medieval period where history records a massive contradiction to European Jewish communities, followed by expansions in Eastern Europe. So, this severe bottleneck of 1200 to 1400 means only a few hundred individuals contributed most of the DNA to later Ashkenazi Jews. That alone explains why the genetic signature looks so homogeneous and why there isn't a wide range of ancestry percentages. By population genetic terms, this creates a founder effect. Whatever genetic mix those few people had becomes dominant in the future populations. And that follows all the way through to today. And that same population of Ashkenazi Jews just happens to have all of these diseases. And very likely, why, besides a white factor, they had to steal all these children to populate. So, so why do these percentages look so low in testing? Well, because the bottleneck reduced the gene pool. Any minority, say, let's say it's 5 to 10%, could easily have been lost by chance or diluted out by later European intermarriages. This is why testing finds Middle East and Eastern admixture clearly, but very little that looks like Khazar or Northern Caucasus ancestry. In other words, small founding members amplify some signals but erase others. Because I'm going by this theory that the ruler mask, I mean that the social ruler of elites or rulers might not show up genetically. Historically, elites and rulers are often a minority of a population. Their genetic contribution is not necessarily proportional to their cultural or political impact. For example, Turkic Khazar elites could have ruled over Slavic, Iranian, and Finno people, but if they converted a small Jewish group and then faded, their genetic trace could be minimal, even if their political influence was huge. So, in the case of Ashkenazi Jews, even if there were symbolic or elite connections to Khazars, the DNA bottleneck might have filtered most of that out. Yeah, because you only got a percentage of. Genetics tells us about demography, not status or identity. A group can wear a ruler mask culturally or politically, but that doesn't mean it guarantees a large genetic imprint. The Ashkenazi bottleneck shows us a group that survived and reproduced, wasn't huge in number. So any elite Khazars could trace either because they vanished genetically or could be swamped with the ancestry. So, yes, if we think of the bottleneck as filtering the gene pool, it could easily explain why genetic tests today show only low percentages from certain regions. It doesn't mean those influences weren't present historically, just that they weren't carried forward biologically because the surviving group was small and their ancestry became the mask we see in the genetic data today. So, yes, if you want to play along with my scenario, this interpretation is logically possible because around 1200 to 1400, Ashkenazi Jews go through a bottleneck so severe that the entire modern population descends only from a few hundred people, or could be the few hundred people which were the originating, the founders, the only people they had, right? There could only have been a tiny, tiny group of them. So that means the genetic profile we see today is not representative of every person who might have been part of the community before this bottleneck. Only those who survived and reproduced will show up. Elites often have low head counts. If the Khazars or Turkish Caucasus elites had a role in the political or religious leadership of Jewish communities at the time, they might have been numerically tiny compared to the broader Levantine European Jewish population. Elites do not always contribute heavily to gene pools because these Mongol elites left large cultural and political impacts, but in many regions outside Central Asia, their genetic footprint is very faint. Small elite populations could be already a minority in the community. And the bottleneck effect, which is a random chance which determines who leaves descendants, if only a few. So those surviving lineages multiply massively, swamping any earlier Khazar-like contribution. So yes, that is likely exactly how it happened. So when scientists today say there is little or no Khazarian ancestry in Ashkenazi Jews, that's based on genetic signatures that survived the bottleneck. But if the Khazars were elite rulers whose numbers were small, then by definition, their DNA would not scale up into the modern population. That allows for the rhetorical move. See, no Khazar ancestry, even though historically there could have been Khazar leadership, Khazar involvement at the leadership level. Historically, Khazars did rule over multi-ethnic populations and are reported in some sources to have adopted Judaism at elite levels. But there's no evidence that the bulk of their subjects converted. Even if the speculation model the Khazar elite Jews could have been a thin layer of leadership that left little or no lasting genetic imprint. Yes, there just were not that many of them. So if the Khazars were indeed elite rulers who converted and interacted with Jewish communities, their low numbers plus the medieval bottleneck could easily erase their signal. That would leave us with today's simple answer in genetics. Little or no Khazar ancestry, but that might not reflect demographics. Excuse me, but that answer might reflect demographics, not politics. Genetic data only captures who reproduced, not who ruled. That gap between social history and population genetics leaves room for exactly the scenario that I'm describing. So when the genome studies say Ashkenazi Jews are Levantine plus European, no major Khazar contributed. That's accurate for the DNA that survived the bottleneck. But that conclusion only describes biological ancestry, not political or cultural influence. Small elite groups can vanish genetically while leaving a massive symbolic, institutional, or cultural legacy. This bottleneck falls around 1200 to 1400, exactly the window when Khazars were fading as a political force and Jewish populations were under severe pressure in Europe. If Khazar elites had indeed joined the Jewish population at that time, they would have been numerically very tiny. The bottleneck then wiped out minority lineages, leaving only a few founder families. That means Khazar DNA could vanish, while the Khazar story or role persisted in other ways. But papers don't emphasize this possibility, not necessarily because of a cover up, but because population genetics isn't designed to measure political or symbolic elites. But the effect is the same. The no Khazar DNA conclusion becomes the headline, while the nuance that elite contributors could easily disappear in a bottleneck or get lost. To someone without a genetics degree, the simpler explanation jumps out. Few Khazars as rulers. The bottleneck erased them. Now we're told no Khazars. It's not crazy, it's actually a logical reading of what's going on. The scientific papers are correct from their frame, their demographic, but my point highlights a blind spot. They did not account for social political roles of minorities during a bottleneck. Oh, yeah, I bet they did. Remember, to become a historian, you need funding. Where do you get your funding from? Well, I don't fund historians, do you? Universities fund historians. All they have to say is, hey, we got this multi-million-dollar book deal for you. You can write this book you've been talking about for years and years about the history of us Jews, and we're so happy to have you do it. And come on over here. You can study in Israel. We got the museum here. We'll give you all the answers you're ever going to need. And guess what? We're going to give you $1 million as a retainer for this book you're going to write. But you know what? We gotta mention one little thing here. Can you lean in here a little bit? We just need to mention one little thing. You know, the Khazar business, we suggest you stay quiet on that. Hey, sign the contract. $1 million will be in your hand next week. That's exactly how this stuff happened. And I'm not saying that every historian gets bought off, but let me tell you, people have to get published, right? You have to go through the system to get published, to get paid. Everybody is hanging on. People will look the other way. We're a nation, a world of people on this game board who excel at looking the other way. So yeah, I've got a very valid gap here. The time frame of the bottleneck overlaps perfectly with when the Khazars could have played an elite role. The lack of Khazar DNA today doesn't necessarily mean no Khazars. It just means their genetic trace didn't survive the contraction expansion cycle. That's the simple answer that gets overlooked. And I've got all the lists of these universities down here for you to take a look at them. All of them, in my worldview, are suspect. But you can make your own opinions, right? That's the whole goal here. Is I'll share my work, and you can think, "Wow, she was off base on that one," or "Wow, I want to go find the answer for myself." Yeah, you can go find the answer for yourself. Download my work. Make copies of it. Go over to ChatGPT. I explained this in the last show. Set up your own research lab in your living room or your bedroom today. I've laid the found work for you. Just go back and copy and paste my last few show notes over my website, feed those into ChatGPT, and then start speculating on your own and see if my analysis matches or not. That's all you have to do. I'm not saying, trust me, you got to believe me. I'm saying I'm presenting a different view than these so called universities. Well, you could say, well, since when did you study history? Well, actually, facts are facts. I didn't study history other than what I got taught in U.S. schools, which are basically lies. So, okay, let me run down the list here, and I really got to close out this file. We have the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, located in Israel. Yeah, nothing to suspect there. We have the Weizmann Institute of Science, also in Israel. Yeah, nothing to suspect there. Their role is a powerhouse in genomics. They ran several genome-wide studies of Jewish population. Yeah, I think that they're sometimes accused of being too close. Yeah, I would say so. Then we have the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, in the United States. Yeah, landmark studies in the late 1990s to 2000 on Jewish disease genetics. Yeah, they identified all the diseases, right? And the critics, strong medical research framing, origins were secondary. Yeah, okay. Then we also have the other institutions, another group of favorite people, Harvard, MIT, in Boston. They're doing genome-wide sequencing, comparative analysis across human populations. Yeah, do you trust any of them? Well, I don't, but you can. Then another player, the Wellcome Sanger Institute in the UK, their role leading European sequence hub, collaborators on Jewish population study. Hey, do you trust them? I don't. Then the last one, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, just so happens to be in Germany. So we have places in Germany. Let me let this truck go by. We have Germany, the US, and the UK as trusted sources. Oh, no reason to be suspicious at all. And then we also have this Human Genome Diversity Project, and they underrepresent small groups. No Khazar samples, obviously. Also, so anyway, so big picture issues across the field. No Khazar skeletons. So they can only use modern proxies. They can only go around to Armenians, Georgians, and North Caucasus. And that's kind of imperfect, if you ask me. So many teams frame the results in terms of debunking Khazar origins, which can look like omission or nuance. Yes, if I team my study, I'm doing a study to debunk the Khazar origins, and I'm at Harvard. What do you exactly think is going on here? Israeli institutions may be seen as biased. Of course they are. Western institutions sometimes avoid messy historical questions. Well, because the West is the one who cooked up this whole plot. Israel is just going along with the plot. Community trust, cases like Wellcome Sanger's African sample disputes highlight how marginalized groups fear exploitation of DNA. So, I don't know. Take a look for yourself. Just by where these universities are located should be your first red flag. And here's the goal here. The goal is to stop painting red flags white. Simple as that. When you see a red flag, dig into it. Don't try to paint it white, okay? Um, and I have the whole history of these people down below. They all came from elite people like this Wellcome Trust. They all came out of the Sanger Institute, which was a pharmaceutical entrepreneur, the largest biomedical research funders. Yeah, none of them are biased as far as I can tell. The UK had a strong eugenics movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Figures like Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, Carl Pearson, and others directly promoted eugenics. Some of these ideas influenced British institutions broadly. Yeah, I think so. While the Wellcome Trust did not brand itself as a eugenics institute, it existed in that environment and was influenced by the same currents of population health, heredity, and control narratives. And today, it's one of the largest genome centers in the world, right there in the UK. Top of the morning to you, London. So, yeah, the head guy, Francis Sanger himself, was not a eugenicist, but a sequencing scientist. The Wellcome Sanger Institute was part of a British scientific ecosystem that historically overlapped with eugenics population control thinking and occasionally faces modern trust issues. Yeah, you think so? So the Sanger brand in genetics is tied by naming funding to a history where eugenics was influenced, even though the institution today frames itself as cutting edge genomics, not population control. Yes, because genomics is the new word for eugenics, right? So, yeah, I think you just got to always do root cause research, always dig down to figure out how these psychopaths got all this stuff started, right? So, my first suspicion came when I looked at those lists of people and thought, wow, nobody from nobody from any of these other countries, right? Nobody from Africa, nobody from here or there. So the name Ashkenazi, let's not forget the basic here. In the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 10:3, Ashkenazi, Ashkenaz is listed as a descendant of Japheth. In early medieval Jewish writings, the name Ashkenaz became associated with the region of Germany, especially the Rhineland. In the 10th to 11th centuries, Jewish communities in the Rhineland, in Mainz, Worms, and Speyer were already calling themselves Ashkenazim, people of Ashkenaz. Ashkenazis in medieval Germany, Ashkenazi Jews, Jews who lived or descended from Jewish communities in Germany speaking Central Europe. From there, they later migrated eastward into Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and Hungary, becoming the dominant Jewish population in Eastern Europe. Their language, Yiddish, reflects this origin, a fusion of Middle High German, Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Slavic elements. Right there in their own language, right? The name ties them to Germany. The name Nazi ties them to that war. But Ashkenazi as an etymology doesn't mean German by origin. It means Jews who settled in Ashkenaz, Germany. Culturally, they adapted elements of German society, language, local customs, while maintaining Jewish religion and communal structures. That's exactly why all of these people, all themselves, tend to trace back to Germany. Not a mystery and not a surprise, because right there from Germany, they went into Eastern Europe. And there we got them, right? So, yes, the name Ashkenazi comes from the medieval Jewish destination for Germany, especially the Rhineland. It reflects where the community crystallized after migrations. Now, of course, they have it in the Bible, right? Because they wrote the Bible. And they have it in Genesis 3. Um, because Ashkenazi Jews were not originally Germanic people, but Jews or gypsies who settled in German lands and created a distinct subculture. They absorbed local influences. Yiddish, which was a Germanic base, plus Hebrew. Customs, they adapted to German law, foodways, even music, while keeping halakha, Jewish legal identity. And this is the catcher. From Germany, they migrated eastward into Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Hungary, forming the majority of European Jewry. And these same people were the ones who ended up in Eastern Europe, who then traveled to Israel to found Israel. So let's finish up with this question. So are Ashkenazis, Jews, the same as Khazars? Name-wise, no. The word Ashkenaz has nothing to do with Khazaria. It's a biblical label mapped onto Germany. Ashkenazi clusters between Levantine and Jewish populations, they say no, there's no genetic. Historically, maybe a silver. Maybe some Khazar elites did convert to Judaism. If any joined the Jewish dysphoria, their numbers were small and their genetic trace most easily erased in the medieval bottleneck. So while there may have been some cultural overlap, conversions, the core of Ashkenazians comes from Jews who crystallized in Germany. So, yeah, Ashkenazian means German Jews. So, yeah, that's how I think it all traced. At least that's how it appears to me. So let me finish up here. Because by the 16th century, Poland, Lithuania had the largest Jewish population in the entire world. Here, Ashkenazi culture flourished. Talmudic academies, Hadhetism, and major rabbinic dynasties emerged right there, 1200 to the 1500s. And the bottleneck was 1200 to 1400. A severe bottleneck reduced Ashkenazi numbers to a small founder group when they expanded again in Eastern Europe. Yeah, I get the picture. I hope you do too, because they expanded to that area that they then and the founders of the State of Israel. The early Zionist movement, which was the late 1800s to the 1940s, and I'll be getting back with a lot more of this in a bit, was led overwhelmingly by Eastern Europe Ashkenazi Jews. Theodor Herzl from Vienna and Austria-Hungary. David Ben-Gurion, born in Poland. Chaim Weizmann, born in Belarus, became Israel's first president. The majority of Jewish immigrants to Palestine before 1948 were Ashkenazi Jews from Russia and Poland, fleeing pogroms, anti-Semitism, and later the Holocaust. Thus, the founding leadership of Israel came directly from Eastern European Ashkenazi communities. And that is exactly how I see it. And see, because the largest universities, genome centers, and public health institutes are funded by governments, trusts, or elite families. Historically, these institutions have never really been neutral. Harvard, Yale, UCL, Cambridge all had professors leading the eugenics movement in the late 19th and 20th century. Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Institute funded forced sterilization programs and radical science. Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany did eugenics research that directly fed into Nazi racial policies. So when we look at these people, it's not paranoid to ask who funds them and what worldview shaped their research priorities. People say that was 100 years ago. Things are different now. But the United States was the last forced sterilization under eugenics laws, and that happened in the 1970s to the 1980s. Not that long ago in my book. Sweden, eugenic sterilization ran in the 1970s, overseen by state health authorities. UK, the eugenics societies didn't fully disappear, they morphed into population study groups. The UN and who are you going to call in the 1960s and 70s, they funded mass sterilization or family planning projects in the global south. In other words, it's not ancient history. It's within all of our living memory. Science isn't pure. It's shaped by funders, politics, and institutions. Many of the same elite families who promoted eugenics are the same families funding genomics today. That doesn't mean every result is false, but it means blind trust is naive. Stop painting red flags white is my motto, especially in questions like Jewish origins, where political narratives like Israel are tightly bound to the science. It's natural to suspect what they're missing and what they're not telling us. It is a mistake to simply sit back and trust the institutions because their track record is not clean, not distant, and not spotified. The legacy of eugenics and government corruption is close enough to shape the present, and pretending it's ancient history erases how those same systems continue today. They have just all been rebranded. So I'll be back with these founder people and maybe we can sort some of this stuff out. But the key thing today is they did not come from that region. Absolutely, without a doubt, they did not come from Israel. And I'll be back when I can tell you more of that story later. So be safe out there.